It's 1963. A cold morning inside a General Motors dyno room. The air smells like oil, hot metal, and something else. Frustration. On the test stand sits an engine that doesn't look like anything else coming out of Detroit. The valve covers are tall and narrow. The intake ports are tiny. The heads look almost wrong. Engineers are gathered around, clipboards in hand, watching the gauges with a mix of concern and curiosity. This isn't what anyone expected. This isn't what the competition was building. And yet, when they fire it up, the torque hits instantly, like a sledgehammer. The dyno cell shakes. The needle on the torque gauge swings hard to the right and just sits there, holding steady at numbers that shouldn't be possible at such low RPM. Someone checks the tachometer, only 2,800 RPM, but the torque already at its peak. But what almost nobody knows is that this engine would become one of the most powerful and most misunderstood V8s of the entire muscle car era. Because the Buick 401 Nailhead wasn't just different, it was too different. And what happened next changed everything. Back in the late 1950s, every major American automaker was chasing one thing: horsepower. The war had started. Bigger engines, bigger carburetors, higher compression ratios, longer cam duration. Everyone wanted top-end power. Pontiac was building the 389. Chevrolet was developing what would become the 409. Ford was pushing its FE big block. Chrysler was experimenting with hemispherical combustion chambers that would eventually spawn the legendary Hemi. But Buick engineers were asking a different question. What if we built an engine that didn't scream, but shoved? Instead of chasing RPM like Ford Motor Company or Chrysler, Buick wanted instant torque, low-end grunt, the kind of pull you feel the moment you touch the throttle, the kind of power that didn't require downshifting or waiting for the engine to climb into its power band. Buick's customer base was different. They weren't buying stripped-down two-door coupes. They were buying luxury cars with leather seats, power windows, air conditioning. They wanted effortless performance, not screaming drama. So they started with something radical: valve angle. Most V8s of the era used wide valve angles, 20 to 30 degrees, to improve airflow at high RPM. This allowed larger valves and better breathing when the engine was spinning fast. But Buick went the opposite direction. They tilted the valves just 14 degrees from vertical, nearly straight up and down. That allowed them to use incredibly small intake and exhaust ports, which meant the heads looked tall, skinny, almost like the head of a nail. That's where the nickname came from, Nailhead. The intake valves measured 1.75 inches in diameter. The exhaust valves were even smaller at 1.44 inches. Compare that to a Chevrolet big block of the same era with 2.06-inch intake valves, and you can see how radical this was. The intake ports were so narrow that mechanics joked you could barely fit your thumb inside. But there was a problem. With ports that small, airflow at high RPM was terrible. The engine couldn't breathe above 5,000 RPM the way a Chevrolet small block could. The restrictive ports created a choke point. At high engine speeds, the cylinders were gasping for air, starving for oxygen. So why would anyone build it this way? Because with a 4.118 75-inch bore and a 3.64-inch stroke, all 401 cubic inches of cast iron were optimized for one thing: torque velocity. Air moved faster through those narrow ports. Fuel atomized better. Combustion was more efficient at lower engine speeds. The physics were simple. Smaller passages meant higher velocity. Higher velocity meant better fuel mixing and more complete combustion. Think of it like putting your thumb over a garden hose. The volume decreases, but the pressure and speed increase. And the result? In its early Wildcat 445 configuration, the 401 produced 325 horsepower at 4,400 RPM and 445 pound-feet of torque at just 2,800 RPM. That wasn't just impressive, that was transmission braking. The Dynaflow and later Super Turbine 400 transmissions had to be specially reinforced to handle the shock loads. First gear launches could twist drive shafts like licorice. Buick's engineering team had to upgrade U-joints, strengthen axle shafts, and beef up differential carriers just to handle what the Nailhead was putting down. But you can probably guess what happened next. As the muscle car wars heated up, Buick needed more power. The 401 was solid, but rivals were catching up. The Chevrolet 409 was revving higher and making headlines in Beach Boys songs. Chrysler's big blocks were pushing compression ratios past 11:1. Pontiac's tri-power setups were appearing on magazine covers. Ford's 427 was dominating NASCAR. The horsepower race was accelerating, and everyone wanted bragging rights. So Buick pushed the Nailhead harder. They raised compression to 10.25.1, installed a hotter camshaft with more lift and duration, added a Carter AFB 4-barrel carburetor flowing over 575 CFM. They revised the exhaust manifolds for better scavenging, upgraded the valve springs to reduce float, even modified the combustion chamber shape slightly to improve flame propagation. Horsepower climbed to 340. Torque stayed monstrous. Drop that into something like the Buick Riviera, and suddenly you had a luxury coupe that could run the quarter mile in the mid-14s at over 95 miles per hour. Some well-tuned examples broke into the high 13s. Not bad for a car that weighed over 4,000 pounds and came standard with power everything, in complete silence. No screaming intake noise, no high-revving drama, just smooth, effortless thrust. You could nail the throttle and hold a conversation. The exhaust note was a deep burble, not an angry howl. Passengers barely noticed you were accelerating hard until they looked at the speedometer and realized you were doing 80. But then the real nightmare started. At sustained high RPM, especially in racing applications, the oiling system began to struggle. Unlike the later 455, the Nailhead fed oil to the valvetrain first, then the crankshaft. The main oil gallery ran up to the rocker shafts before circulating down to the main bearings. This was fine for street driving where RPM rarely sustained above 4,000. But on the drag strip, so at 5,200 RPM or higher, oil pressure to the mains dropped like a rock. Bearings overheated, crank journals scored, metal shavings filled the oil pan. The oil simply couldn't get to the bottom end fast enough. The rockers and valve train were gulping down all the pressure. By the time oil reached the crankshaft, there wasn't enough volume or pressure left to maintain the hydrodynamic film on the bearing surfaces. Metal-to-metal contact occurred, heat spiked, and catastrophic failure followed. Mechanic Don Sullivan reportedly said, "We pulled one apart after a drag pass, and the bearings looked like charcoal briquettes." Buick engineers knew exactly what was happening. The top end was stealing oil from the bottom, so they revised the oil passages, increasing main gallery diameter and improving flow to the crankshaft at sustained load. They also upgraded rod bearings and recommended heavier 20W50 racing oil for competition use. Some factory-backed race teams even drilled additional oil return passages to get oil back to the sump faster. Windage trays were added to prevent oil slosh. Baffles kept oil near the pickup. Simple changes, but brutally effective. And by 1964, the 401 Nailhead was dominating in an unexpected place, NHRA Superstock. In factory-backed drag cars like the Buick Wildcat, racers were seeing quarter-mile times in the low 13-second range. Some modified versions dipped into the 12s. Teams like the Buick GS Development Group were extracting insane performance from these engines. They weren't building high-revving screamers. They were building low RPM torque monsters that pulled so hard off the line that traction became the limiting factor. At over 105 mph, not because the engine revved high, but because it didn't have to. Peak torque came so early that full throttle launches felt like getting rear-ended by a freight train. Drive shafts twisted, rear axles snapped, Dynaflow transmissions cried for mercy. Tire technology of the era couldn't handle it. Even with heavy-duty suspensions and traction bars, getting all that torque to the ground was nearly impossible, and still, the Nailhead kept pulling. Drivers learned to feather the throttle in first gear just to keep the tires from going up in smoke. But once you hit second gear and the car hooked up, nothing else could stay with it in the mid-range. While other engines were still climbing toward peak power, the Nailhead was already there, pulling like a freight locomotive from 2,500 RPM all the way to redline. So why didn't it take over the world? Why didn't Buick's torque monster become the next small block Chevy? Because the same thing that made it brilliant also made it impossible to scale. Those tiny ports meant there was almost no room for improvement. You couldn't just slap on bigger valves or open up the intake runners. The head casting simply didn't allow it. The valve angles were fixed. The combustion chamber design was locked in. Trying to port the heads aggressively just created turbulence without improving flow. Overbore it more than 0.030 inches? Cylinder walls got dangerously thin. The block casting had relatively thin cylinder walls to begin with. Push it beyond a 0.030-inch overbore and you risked cracking or breaking through into the water jackets. Some racers tried boring at 0.060 over, but reliability dropped dramatically. Blocks cracked under racing loads. Try to spin it past 5,500 RPM? Valvetrain instability kicked in. The rocker shaft system, great for durability, became a liability at higher speeds. Valve float showed up early. Power dropped off a cliff after 4,800 RPM. The narrow ports simply couldn't flow enough air at high velocities. Volumetric efficiency plummeted. Instead of making more power, the engine just made more noise and heat. And in a world that was rapidly shifting toward high-revving horsepower numbers, that mattered. By 1965, engines like the 396 and 426 Hemi were pushing 400-plus horsepower in factory trim. Magazine covers didn't talk about torque curves. They talked about peak horsepower. Car and Driver tested quarter-mile times. Hot Rod magazine published dyno sheets showing peak numbers. Nobody was publishing torque curves at 2 on the 800 RPM. They talked about peak horsepower. And the Nailhead simply couldn't compete on paper, even though on the street, it often won. Real-world driving happens between 2,000 and 4,500 RPM. That's where the Nailhead lived. While a 427 Ford needed 6,000 RPM to make peak power, the Buick was already at full torque before most engines even woke up. In stoplight racing, in highway merges, in everyday driving, the Nailhead demolished the competition. But you think that's where the story ends? Not even close. Insurance companies started noticing something strange. Buick buyers weren't supposed to be drag racing luxury coupes down Woodward Avenue. Buick's demographic was older, more conservative, more responsible. These were doctors and lawyers, not street racers. And yet claims were rising, fast. Rear-end failures, transmission replacements, suspension damage, all traced back to massive low-end torque spikes during hard launches. Insurance adjusters couldn't understand how a luxury car was breaking driveline components like a race car. Claims data showed Buick Wildcats and Rivieras were having the same failure rates as Pontiac GTOs and Chevrolet Chevelles. Premiums went up. And by the late 1960s, emissions regulations and new fuel standards made the Nailhead's high compression ratios increasingly difficult to maintain. The market was changing. Smooth torque was out. High-revving efficiency was in. The Clean Air Act was coming. Unleaded fuel requirements would kill high compression. Smog controls were being mandated. The writing was on the wall. And the Nailhead, with its old-school design and fixed architecture, couldn't adapt easily. In 1967, Buick quietly replaced the 401 with a new generation of big block V8s, including the 430, and later, the 455. The Nailhead was gone. Production ended after nearly a decade of service. Tooling was scrapped. Blocks were melted down. Patterns were destroyed. And just like that, one of the most unique engines Detroit had ever built disappeared. But here's the twist. Today, the 401 Nailhead has become something of a legend. Not because it made the most horsepower, not because it set the most records, not because it appeared in the most magazine articles, but because it didn't follow the rules. Its vertical valve layout, its narrow ports, its obsession with torque over RPM, all of it flew in the face of conventional engine design at the time. Every engineering textbook said you needed big valves and big ports for power. Buick said otherwise and proved it. And yet, it worked. Street versions made up to 340 horsepower and 445 pound-feet of torque with a single 4-barrel carb. Race-prepped variants pushed even further with dual quads and aggressive timing curves. Some experimental versions with radical cams and modified heads cracked 400 horsepower, though reliability suffered. It could move a 4,200-pound Riviera from 0 to 60 in under 7.5 seconds in 1964, when most luxury cars struggled to break 10 seconds, when a 0 to 60 time under 8 seconds was considered sports car territory. The Riviera did it while coddling passengers in leather seats with the air conditioning running. That's what made it special. The Buick 401 Nailhead didn't win by revving higher. It won by hitting harder. It was an engine built for the real world, not the spec sheet. A machine designed to shove 2 tons of American steel off the line without breaking a sweat. An engine that prioritized how it felt over how it looked on paper. Too unique for mass production, too stubborn for evolution, but unforgettable. Hot rodders today still seek out Nailhead cores for custom builds, not because they're the most powerful option, but because there's something special about an engine that makes peak torque at 2,800 RPM. Something addictive about throttle response that feels instantaneous. Something uniquely American about an engine that doesn't care about your tachometer. If you enjoyed this story, let me know what you want to see next. Another forgotten torque monster, a racing legend, or an engine that changed the rules. And make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next deep dive into the machines that shaped automotive history.